Hello there, my night owls. Tonight, we are stepping into the world of the Vampire Diaries and telling the entire story of Dark Reunion, the fourth and final book in L.J. Smith's original Vampire Diaries series. Elena Gilbert is gone. Her friends are grieving. And something ancient and deeply dangerous has found its way into Fell's Church. Something that will ask more of the people she left behind than anything they have ever faced before. If there is a Vampire Diaries story you would love to fall asleep to next, tell me in the comments. I would love to create it for you. Alright, get comfortable. Close your eyes and let the Dark Reunion begin. Fell's Church did not know how to grieve quietly. It was too small a town for that, too tightly woven. Every family connected to every other family by the threads of shared history and shared streets and the particular intimacy of a place where everyone had known everyone else's name since childhood. When something broke in Fell's Church, it broke in public, visible to everyone. Mourned collectively even when the mourning was private. And something had broken. Elena Gilbert was gone. The fact of it sat in the center of the town, like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples moving outward through every home and classroom and dinner table conversation, reshaping the surface of everything it touched. She had been 17 years old, golden-haired and extraordinary, the kind of girl that small towns produce once in a generation and remember forever afterward. She had been loved, and she had loved, and now she was absent in a way that the people of Fell's Church were still learning the shape of, still pressing against with cautious and disbelieving hands, the way you press against a bruise to confirm it is real. The official story. The story the adults told each other, and the newspaper printed, and the school counselors referenced in their careful, gentle conversations with students, was incomplete in all the ways that official stories always are, when the truth they are covering for is something no official framework could contain. There had been an incident, there had been danger and loss, and Elena Gilbert was no longer among the living. The specifics remained unclear to most of Fell's Church, and the people who knew the specifics were not in a position to share them. 3 of those people were sitting in Caroline Forbes's former friend group's usual lunch spot, which none of them had abandoned because abandoning it would have required acknowledging too many things at once. Bonnie McCullough sat with her knees drawn up, small and red-haired and quieter than she had ever been in her life before this autumn. Beside her, Meredith Sewell sat with the composed stillness she brought to everything, her dark hair falling straight and her hands folded on the table, looking for all the world like someone who was managing perfectly well, which was exactly what she intended to look like. And Matt Honeycutt sat across from both of them, broad-shouldered and golden-haired in the way that had always made people think of him as Elena's natural counterpart, staring at the middle distance with the particular expression of someone whose grief is too large to fit inside a normal face and has therefore been carefully removed from it entirely. Stefan was gone. He had left Fell's Church in the days following Elena's death, unable to remain in the place where she had died, where every street and building and angle of afternoon light carried the specific texture of her presence and therefore the specific texture of her absence. He had said goodbye to no one, or if he had, the goodbye had been too quiet to leave a mark that anyone could identify afterward. He was simply gone, the way he had arrived, with that particular vampire capacity for disappearing from a place so completely that the place closed over behind him like water over a stone. Damon had also gone, though his departure carried its own distinct quality, less the withdrawal of grief and more the evaporation of something that had never quite committed to being present in the first place. He had been there, and then he had not been, and the absence of him was different from the absence of Stefan in ways that were difficult to articulate, but impossible to miss. What remained was the three of them, and the town, and the weight of everything they knew that they could not say. "I keep thinking I see her," Bonnie said one afternoon, not for the first time. They were in Meredith's kitchen by then, in the warm amber light of a late October afternoon that had no business being as beautiful as it was. Not like a ghost, just out of the corner of my eye, the way you think you've seen something and then you turn and the space is empty. "That's normal," Meredith said. "After loss, the mind keeps reaching for what it expects to find." "I know it's normal," Bonnie said. "I just wish it would stop, because every time it happens, I have about half a second of being completely fine, and then I'm not fine, and then not being fine is worse for the half second before it." Matt said nothing for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table, watching it as though it required his full attention. Then he said, "She wouldn't want us to be like this." "No," Meredith agreed. "She'd want us to be doing something," he said. "She was always doing something." The silence that followed was the kind that agreed with everything and solved nothing, which was most of the silences they had been living inside since September. Bonnie had been experiencing things she could not explain and had not yet found the right words to describe to the others. They had begun small, the way most significant things begin, easy to dismiss individually and only alarming in retrospect when you laid them alongside each other. An impression on the edge of waking, not quite a dream and not quite a thought, carrying an emotional weight that did not belong to anything in her own experience. The sensation, twice now while walking home from school, of passing through something, not a physical barrier, but a change in the quality of the air itself. A brief and specific alteration that raised the small hairs on her arms and then was gone before she could examine it. And once, sitting alone in her room the previous Tuesday evening, the absolute and unambiguous conviction that someone was trying to get her attention, that something at the edge of her perception was pressing toward her with intention and urgency, and the particular quality of someone calling a name from a very great distance. She had been afraid of these things. That was the honest truth of it. The psychic ability that ran through the women in her family was not something Bonnie had ever fully embraced or comfortably inhabited. She had acknowledged it. She had even in moments of necessity, used it. But the idea of leaning into it, of opening herself deliberately to whatever moved at the edges of ordinary perception, frightened her in ways that were difficult to set aside. It was Meredith who finally asked her directly. They were walking home from school on a Wednesday, the leaves gone orange and gold on the trees lining Cemetery Ridge Road, the sky above them a deep and depthless blue. Meredith had been quiet for most of the walk, which meant she had been thinking about something specific. "You've been different this week," Meredith said. Not an accusation, an observation delivered with the careful neutrality of someone who wanted a true answer and understood that pressure would prevent one. "Different how?" Bonnie asked, though she knew. "Distracted, and not the grief kind of distracted. Something else." Bonnie was quiet for half a block. Then she said, "I think something is trying to reach me. I don't know what. I don't know if it's Elena, or something connected to Elena, or something that has nothing to do with Elena at all. But something is there, at the edge of things, and it has been there for days, and it is getting closer." Meredith stopped walking. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because saying it makes it real," Bonnie said, "and I was hoping it would stop on its own." "Has it stopped?" "No," Bonnie said. "It's gotten stronger." They told Matt that evening. All three of them gathered at the McCullough house around the kitchen table, with the comfortable chaos of Bonnie's family moving through the house around them. The particular invisibility of a private conversation happening in a busy home. Matt listened with his full attention, his elbows on the table, his expression serious and undefended in the way it always was when something mattered. "What does it feel like?" he asked. "When it reaches for you?" "Familiar," Bonnie said slowly, working through it as she spoke. "And urgent. Not frightening exactly, though it does frighten me. It's like..." She paused, searching. "It's like when you hear someone calling your name from another room, and you know the voice, you absolutely know it, but you can't quite place it because the walls are in the way." Matt and Meredith exchanged a look over the table. "Do you think it's her?" Matt asked, and his voice was very careful and very quiet around the word her. "I think it might be," Bonnie said. "I think Elena might be trying to tell us something." The room felt different after she said it, the way rooms sometimes feel different after a truth has been spoken aloud in them, as though the air has rearranged itself slightly to accommodate what is now present. They decided to try. Meredith cleared the table and dimmed the lights, and Matt sat beside Bonnie without touching her, close enough for his steadiness to be felt, and Bonnie closed her eyes and opened herself outward in the direction of whatever had been pressing toward her, meeting it halfway for the first time instead of flinching away. What happened was not dramatic. There was no cold wind, no flickering lights, none of the theatrical machinery of the ghost stories they had all grown up with. What happened was quieter and stranger, and in its own way, more convincing than anything theatrical could have been. Bonnie felt the connection form the way you feel a door open in a house you are standing in. Not seeing it, not hearing it, but knowing from the change in pressure that something has shifted, that air is moving between spaces that were separate a moment ago. And then she was speaking, and the words were not hers. The voice that came through her was familiar to both Matt and Meredith, in a way that made Matt push back from the table, and Meredith's careful composure crack briefly, visibly. before she collected it again. It was not Elena's voice exactly, not her particular timbre and cadence, but it was shaped by Elena's way of thinking, by the particular patterns of her attention and her caring, and those patterns were unmistakable to the people who had loved her. The words were fragmentary, arriving with gaps between them, the way a signal arrives through interference, clear in patches and then lost and then clear again. She was somewhere. She was aware of them. She was trying to tell them something, and the distance was making the telling difficult. What came through most clearly was not information but feeling, a quality of urgency that pressed through the fragmented words like the urgency itself was more durable than the language carrying it. "Something is coming," was the clearest phrase. It came through twice, with a particular emphasis of repetition, and then the connection thinned and broke, and Bonnie came back to herself with a gasp that she hadn't known she was holding, blinking in the low light of her own kitchen, with Matt's hand gripping her arm, and Meredith standing very still across the table. "Something is coming," Meredith repeated. Her voice was neutral, processing. "That's what she said." "That's what came through," Bonnie corrected. She was trying to say more. "I could feel that there was more. But the distance is..." She searched for the word. "It's like calling across a very wide and very deep river. Some of it carries, some of it doesn't." Matt released her arm slowly. He looked at his own hands for a moment and then looked up. "She wouldn't reach this hard if it wasn't important," he said. "Elena never did anything without a reason." "No," Meredith agreed. "She didn't." "So something is coming," he said. "And she needs us to know before it arrives." The three of them sat with that in the warm light of the kitchen, with the sounds of Bonnie's family moving through the house around them, with the ordinary world continuing on all sides, and none of them said the thing they were all thinking, which was that something arriving in Fell's church, announced by Elena from wherever she was, heralded by days of pressing supernatural awareness, was not likely to be something gentle, was not likely to be something that their particular collection of human courage and tentative psychic ability was remotely equipped to face alone. Outside, the October evening had deepened into full dark. The streetlights of Fell's church had come on one by one in the way they always did, reliable and ordinary, marking the familiar grid of the town in warm amber. Bonnie looked at the window and the darkness beyond it and felt, for just a moment, the returning edge of that pressure she had been carrying for days. Faint now, quieter than it had been all week, as though whatever had been pressing toward her had received something it needed from the session and had temporarily withdrawn. But it was still there, still present at the edges, still patient. Something was coming. Elena knew it. And Elena, from wherever she was, had decided that the people who loved her needed to be warned. That night, Bonnie lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the voice that had moved through her. The warmth of it, beneath the urgency, the way even through the interference and the distance and the strange medium of a psychic connection, it had been recognizably, irrefutably Elena, caring even now, reaching even from there, trying to protect them from a distance she could not cross and a danger she could not fully name. She fell asleep eventually, and she did not dream. And in the morning, the pressure was waiting for her again at the edge of waking, steady and patient, and slightly closer than it had been the day before. Days passed the way days do after catastrophe, not quickly, not with any mercy, but with a slow and indifferent turning of a world that did not understand it was supposed to have stopped. Fell's Church woke each morning and went through its routines. Shops opened. Teachers wrote assignments on chalkboards. Cars moved through the familiar streets in familiar patterns. Children walked to school in groups the way they always had. Backpacks bouncing, conversations overlapping, the ordinary noise of ordinary life continuing without permission or apology. And beneath all of it, beneath every ordinary surface, something was wrong in a way that most people could feel, but none could name. Bonnie felt it most acutely. She had always been sensitive, even before she understood what that sensitivity meant, even before her grandmother had sat with her and spoken quietly about the women in their family and the particular awareness that moved through their blood like a second pulse. Now that awareness was sharper than it had ever been, honed by everything she had witnessed and survived and lost. She walked through the halls of Robert E. Lee High School and felt the town like a living thing around her, and what she felt in it was not right. There was a pressure she could not locate, a low and constant wrongness that pressed at the edges of her perception, the way a sound presses at the edges of hearing, present but not quite audible, felt in the bones rather than processed by the ears. It reminded her of the feeling before a storm, that atmospheric heaviness that animals respond to before any human instrument confirms what they already know. Except no storm she had ever felt had carried this particular quality of intention. Weather did not intend. Whatever was pressing against Fell's Church did. She tried to describe it to Meredith one afternoon, sitting in the Sules kitchen with untouched cups of tea cooling between them on the table. The kitchen was warm and familiar, full of the kind of domestic detail that made the world feel manageable. A dish towel folded over the oven handle, a small pot of herbs on the windowsill, the distant sound of a television from another room. Meredith listened the way she always listened, with her full and careful attention, her dark eyes steady and her hands still on the table. She did not dismiss what Bonnie was saying. Meredith had never been someone who dismissed things simply because they were difficult to categorize. But Bonnie could see her working the description over in her mind, turning it carefully, like an object she was trying to understand from all angles, trying to find a framework that could hold it, and coming up short in ways that clearly frustrated her. Like a pressure, Bonnie said again, trying a different approach, like something pushing, not from outside, not exactly, more like from underneath, like the ground itself has changed and everything built on it is slightly different because of it, even though nothing looks different from the surface. Meredith was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving briefly to the window and the grey afternoon beyond it. Then she said, "Has it gotten stronger since the first time you noticed it?" Bonnie thought about that carefully, giving the question the serious attention it deserved, rather than rushing to an answer that felt reassuring. She traced the sensation back through the days, measuring it against what she remembered from the week before and the week before that. "Yes," she said, "every day a little. Not in a way you'd notice if you were only paying attention to one day. But if you set them beside each other, the difference is clear." That was the thing Meredith wrote down in the small notebook she had begun keeping. The one she did not show to anyone yet, but carried with her everywhere, tucking it into her bag with a particular care she gave to things that mattered. She had started the notebook the night after Bonnie's first trance, the night Elena had seemed to speak through her friend's borrowed voice, filling its pages with observations and dates and the careful cross-referencing of details that was her particular form of courage. She did not know what she was building toward, only that something was being built, and that the work of noticing and recording was the only thing available to her that felt like meaningful action. Meredith had always understood that the accumulation of careful observation was its own kind of power, slower than intuition and less dramatic, but more reliable, more durable, more difficult to dismiss. Matt heard about the pressure from both of them separately, which was how he usually received information now, in pieces that he assembled quietly and steadily on his own before saying anything back. He had his own version of the wrongness, though he would not have called it a pressure, and would not have thought to reach for Bonnie's intuitive language to describe it. For Matt, it was simpler, and in some ways more disturbing. He was a person who trusted his instincts in the uncomplicated way that came from spending years reading a football field, from understanding bodies in space and the intentions behind movement, from learning to feel the shape of a situation before the individual facts of it fully resolved. And his instincts had been telling him for days that something was watching. Not him specifically, not any individual person. The town, Fells Church as a whole, observed by something that had not yet decided what it wanted to do with what it was seeing. Something patient enough to watch for a long time before moving. He did not say this to Bonnie because he did not want to add to what she was already carrying. He was not yet sure, saying it to himself clearly enough to say it to anyone else without it sounding like the kind of thing people said when grief had made them see shapes and shadows. Then came the Thursday that changed the texture of their fear from vague to specific. A girl named Vicky Bennett, who had been present at the cemetery months ago when everything had first torn open, was found on the school grounds in a state that no one could adequately explain. She was sitting on a bench near the gymnasium, in the open air, with her backpack beside her and her hands folded in her lap in the composed way of someone who had chosen to sit there. She was not physically injured in any way the school nurse could identify. She was conscious and responsive to her name, but she was not present in any meaningful sense. Her eyes moved over the faces of the people who gathered around her without recognition, as though she were looking through them at something positioned slightly behind the visible world, and what she saw there held her complete and unbreakable attention. When she finally spoke, what she said was a single sentence, delivered 3 times in a voice that was her own, but inflected strangely, stripped of its usual teenage cadences, and emptied into something flat and deliberate, the way a voice sounds when it is being used as an instrument by something that doesn't fully understand the instrument it is playing. He says hello. No one in the small crowd that had gathered knew what to do with that. The school called her mother. Her mother came quickly, her face tight with the fear she was trying not to show, and took Vicky home and told the principal it was a breakdown, stress, too much grief over the losses Fells Church had already suffered this year. The principal accepted this because the alternative required a vocabulary he did not have and a framework he had never been given reason to build. Bonnie stood at the edge of that small crowd, close enough to see Vicky's face clearly, before her mother led her away, and she felt what no one else in that hallway or on that courtyard bench seemed to feel. She felt the residue of what had been done. Not an illness, not a breakdown, not anything that belonged in the established categories of human psychological crisis. Something had touched Vicky Bennett, had reached into her with the casual ease of someone opening a door that was never intended to be open from the outside, had moved things around in the interior of her experience, and had left its fingerprints on her from the inside in a way that Bonnie's extended perception could read the way you read handwriting. And what those fingerprints felt like was enormous and cold and faintly, terribly amused. The amusement was the worst part. It transformed every other quality of what she was sensing into something more disturbing than simple malevolence would have been. Because malevolence at least implied that you mattered enough to be hated. This was the amusement of something that found you interesting without finding you significant. The amusement of something that was playing a game the other participants did not yet know they were in. She found Meredith between classes and pulled her into an empty classroom and told her everything she had felt, keeping her voice low and level with a kind of deliberate effort that left her slightly breathless when she finished, as if the steadiness itself had cost her something. Meredith absorbed it in silence and then said, "It's not what we've dealt with before." "No," Bonnie agreed. "Nothing like it." Stefan and Damon both fed differently than this. What was done to Vicky isn't feeding. It's not about blood or power in the way we understand those things. She paused, sorting through possibilities with the precise efficiency of someone cataloguing items in a library. It's communication. It's using her as a medium the way you use a piece of paper to carry a message. "Something that wants to be known," Bonnie said, and then paused at her own words, tracing them back to their source, understanding that they had not come from her reasoning mind, but from the residue she had touched in that courtyard, from the quality of impression that had been left behind on the air and on Vicky, and on the particular chill of that bench in the open autumn light. Whatever had touched Vicky had done so deliberately, not out of hunger and not out of simple cruelty, but as a form of introduction, a calling card delivered through a person the way you might press a seal into wax. The message was the medium. Vicky was the envelope, and the sender had wanted them specifically to understand that. They told Matt that evening. The three of them gathered in Meredith's room with the door closed and the notebook open, and they spread what they had across the space between them, the way you spread a map when you are lost and trying to orient yourself, trying to make the landscape readable by laying it flat and looking at it all at once. What they had was not a comfortable picture, but it was a picture, and that was something. There was a pattern. Once Meredith laid the incidents alongside each other in chronological order with her notes beside each entry, the pattern became visible in the way that patterns always become visible when you stop looking at individual events and start looking at the spaces between them, at the intervals and the progressions, and the particular logic of escalation. 2 weeks ago, a freshman boy named Douglas had come home from school unable to account for 45 minutes of his Wednesday afternoon, sitting at his kitchen table when his parents returned home, staring at nothing with his backpack still on his shoulders, as though he had sat down the moment he walked through the door and had not moved since. His parents had put it down to adolescent spacing out, to the distraction of grief the whole town was carrying, and had not thought further about it. A week ago, a dog belonging to a family on Elm Street had been found at the edge of the cemetery at sunrise, unharmed but fundamentally altered in some way that only the family noticed, flinching from shadows that other dogs ignored, refusing to enter rooms it had previously loved, sitting at the back door and staring outward for hours with an intensity that suggested it was watching something approach from a very great distance. And now Vicky, who was not the beginning but felt unmistakably like an escalation, like a dial being turned with measured patience. "It's testing," Matt said. He had been quiet for most of the conversation, in the way he was often quiet, letting things settle before responding to them, processing in the steady, unhurried way that was his particular strength. Whatever this is, it's not going after people because it needs something from them. It's going after people to observe the results, to measure what happens. He paused and then said the rest of it, the part he had been sitting with for days without saying aloud. "And I think it knows we're paying attention. I think that's part of the point." The room was very quiet after that. Outside, the sounds of Fell's Church at evening, a car passing, someone's radio carrying faintly through a window, the distant bark of a dog, all of it perfectly ordinary and completely insufficient. No one had a counter-argument to offer, because what Matt had said matched what Bonnie had felt in the courtyard and what Meredith had been assembling in her careful handwriting, and the convergence of all three of them arriving at the same conclusion from different directions carried its own terrible weight. "We can't handle this," Bonnie said. She said it without apology and without performance, simply as an honest assessment of their situation, because pretending otherwise would be a waste of time they did not have. "We don't know what it is. We don't know what it can do. We don't have the knowledge or the power to fight something operating at this level. And we don't have anyone who understands this world well enough to help us navigate it." She looked at both of them in turn and said what had been true for days without being spoken. "We need Stefan." The word settled into the room with the particular weight of something that has been true for a long time, before it was finally said aloud. They needed Stefan. Not because he was the answer to every problem, not because his presence would make this simple or safe, but because he inhabited the world that was pressing against Fell's Church in a way that none of them did. He had the knowledge, the centuries of accumulated understanding, the supernatural perception that could read what Bonnie could only feel in approximations. And he had something else, something harder to name but no less real. The particular courage of someone who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to him and had chosen to keep going anyway. He had gone, and they did not know where. And reaching him would require Bonnie to extend her psychic ability further than she had ever deliberately extended it. Not further than it had gone on its own during the trances, when it had moved without her conscious direction, but further than she had ever driven it with intention. The distinction mattered. Intentional effort was a different kind of exhausting. She said she would try. Meredith moved the lamp to the floor to lower the light in the room to something softer and less intrusive. Matt positioned himself beside Bonnie on the bed, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him without them touching. And that warmth mattered more than she would have expected. That simple, uncomplicated human proximity. That reminder that she was not doing this alone, even if the doing of it was something only she could accomplish. She closed her eyes and worked on settling her breathing, slowing it down by increments, releasing the tension in her shoulders and her jaw and her hands until she was as physically quiet as she could make herself. Then she reached, not with effort, not with grasping or urgency, because her grandmother had been clear about that, had told her more than once that the reaching that worked was not the reaching of strain, but the reaching of openness, of making yourself receptive and spacious and still, of becoming the kind of vessel that something could find rather than the kind of hand that could grab. She held the shape of Stefan in her mind, not his appearance, but his presence, the particular quality of his attention and his stillness, and the grief he carried like a wound he had stopped trying to hide. She held that shape and sent herself outward along it like water following the channel of a riverbed, following the memory of who he was as a path toward wherever he actually was. The experience was disorienting in a way that resisted description. There was no visual component, not exactly, nothing that translated into images she could have reproduced afterward. It was more like finding something at the end of a very long reach, like pressing your hand through darkness and touching something solid on the other side without being able to see what you were touching. She found something that felt like Stefan, not his thoughts and not his specific experience, but his signature, the quality of his presence that was as individual and unmistakable as a voice you have known for years, recognizable before you have consciously processed what you are recognizing. She pressed toward it with everything she had. She pressed urgency and recognition and the specific feeling of need, not performed need, but real need, the need of 3 people sitting in a room, in a town that was being circled by something ancient and amused and patient. She pressed all of it outward along that fragile thread of connection and held it there for as long as she could before the effort exhausted itself and the thread dissolved, and she came back to Meredith's room, to the lamp on the floor, and Matt's warmth beside her, and the ordinary sounds of the evening outside the windows. She opened her eyes. Her head ached deeply, a pressure behind her temples that she recognized as the cost of extension. "I don't know if he heard it," she said. "What did it feel like from your side?" Meredith asked carefully. Bonnie considered, turning the experience over, trying to translate it into words that would carry the truth of it. Like knocking on a door you can't see, in a house you can't find. You don't know if anyone is inside. You don't know if the sound carries, but you knocked, and the knocking was real. Matt handed her a glass of water without being asked, and she drank it, and the 3 of them sat together in the quiet of the room, while outside the windows, Fell's Church settled into its night routines, street lights coming on in the thickening dark, houses warming with the yellow light of kitchens and the blue light of television screens, the whole ordinary machinery of a small town closing down its day. It was a town that did not know what was moving through it, and the not knowing was its own kind of vulnerability. It was later, after Bonnie and Matt had gone home, and Meredith was alone updating her notebook in the low light of the lamp. She had moved back to her desk, that the details she had been carrying without fully examining finally surfaced. She had noticed something in the courtyard where Vicky had been found, a quality she had registered with her body before her mind had processed it. Something about the air in that specific location that had been slightly, wrongly different from the air 6 feet away. She had filed it and moved on because there had been more immediate things to attend to. She examined it now with the patient attention she gave to everything she was not yet sure how to use. The temperature. The air near where Vicky had been sitting had been cooler than it should have been by a margin that was small but definite. The kind of cold that had no meteorological explanation on a still afternoon with no wind. She wrote it down. She underlined it twice. And then in the margin beside it, in the small, careful letters she used for conclusions she was not yet ready to commit to fully, she wrote, "Not hunger, not local, very old." She had not finished the thought when her phone rang. Matt's name on the screen, and the hour was wrong for a casual call, and she knew before she answered it that whatever he was about to tell her had reordered everything again. The groundskeeper who opened the school each morning had found a teacher standing at the edge of the athletic field in the grey pre-dawn, facing the tree line, perfectly still in the frost-stiff grass. Her coat was open despite the cold. She was wearing exactly what she had been wearing when she left the building the evening before, as though no time had passed for her, even though a full night clearly had. She was unresponsive to her name. When the groundskeeper finally touched her shoulder with the tentative care of someone not certain what they were approaching, she turned to face him, and her eyes were clear and ordinary and entirely present in the way that Vicky's had not been. And she said, in a voice that was warm and conversational and completely her own, the words that had been placed inside her like an object placed inside a room. "Tell them I am looking forward to meeting them." Then she blinked, and the sentence was gone from her, and she had no memory of having been in that field at all. Meredith set down her notebook and reached for her phone. Whatever was in Fell's church had finished its introductions. It had moved on to the next thing, and the next thing, whatever shape it took, was already on its way. He came back the way grief returns, quietly and without announcement, present suddenly where he had not been a moment before. There was no dramatic arrival, no moment where the town of Fell's church registered his return and adjusted itself accordingly. Stefan Salvatore simply appeared at the edge of things one grey November morning, driving a car that Bonnie did not recognize down a street she had walked 100 times. And the first indication any of them had that he was back was a phone call from Matt, whose voice carried something in it that she had not heard since before everything broke. "He's here," Matt said. That was all. It was enough. They gathered at Meredith's house because Meredith's house was where they always gathered when something mattered, drawn there by the habit of crisis and the particular steadiness that Meredith's presence lent to difficult things. Bonnie arrived first, which was unusual, and stood in the kitchen helping Meredith make tea that neither of them would drink, because the making of it was something to do with their hands while they waited. Matt arrived a few minutes later, letting himself in through the back door the way he always did, dropping into his usual chair at the kitchen table with the careful movements of someone managing a weight that was not physical. They did not talk very much while they waited. There was not much to say that the waiting itself was not already saying. Stefan arrived last, which surprised none of them, because Stefan had always moved through the world with a consideration for other people's comfort that expressed itself in small and deliberate courtesies. The kind of courtesies that a person raised in another century carried into this one without quite being aware that they were doing it. He knocked, though the door was unlocked. He waited in the entryway until Meredith gestured him further in. He accepted the tea that Meredith handed him and held it without drinking it, which was exactly what all of them were doing, and the symmetry of it was the first thing in a long time that had made Bonnie want to smile, though she did not quite manage it. He was thinner. That was the first thing she registered. The way his jacket sat differently on his shoulders than it had in September. The way his face had sharpened in a manner that had nothing to do with his vampire nature and everything to do with weeks of not properly caring for himself. His green eyes were the same, intensely and almost painfully present, but what lived in them now was different from what had been there before. Before, those eyes had carried the carefully managed grief of someone who had survived centuries of loss and had developed, over all that time, the tools to carry it without being destroyed by it. Now they carried something rawer, something that the centuries of practice had not been sufficient to manage, because this particular loss had not been like the others. This one had been Elena. And Elena, for Stefan, had been something that did not have a precedent in any of the centuries behind him. He looked at each of them in turn when he sat down, and the looking itself was a form of communication, a quiet acknowledgement that they were here, that they had stayed, that the fact of their continued presence in this town and in each other's lives was something he registered and did not take for granted. Bonnie felt the look settle on her for a moment longer than the others, and understood that he was acknowledging the reaching she had done, the psychic effort she had extended in his direction, without knowing if anything would arrive at the other end. "Thank you for reaching out," he said, and his voice was quieter than Bonnie remembered it, though no less precise. He looked at her specifically when he said it. "I felt it. Whatever you said, it found me." "I wasn't sure it had," Bonnie said. "I couldn't tell if anything got through. It felt like knocking on a door in a house I couldn't see." "It got through," Stefan said. "Not clearly, but enough." He paused, and in the pause, Bonnie could feel him deciding how much to say about what the receiving of it had been like, deciding against saying most of it. "I understood that something was wrong, that you needed me here." "Something is wrong," Meredith said, and opened her notebook on the table between them with the matter-of-fact directness that was her particular gift, the ability to move from emotion to action without dismissing either, without requiring a transitional moment of acknowledgement that slowed things down. "We've been documenting it. I want you to hear everything in order, because the order matters. The pattern only becomes visible when you have all of it in sequence." Stefan nodded and set his untouched tea on the table and listened. He listened the way he always listened, with a quality of attention that Bonnie had always found both comforting and slightly unnerving. The absolute stillness of him, the absence of the small unconscious movements that humans made when they were receiving information, the fidgeting and the small adjustments of posture that were the body's way of processing what the mind was taking in. Stefan had none of that. He simply received, completely and without interruption, everything that Meredith and the others laid out for him. The incident with Vicky Bennett and the words she had delivered in a voice borrowed from somewhere other than herself. The teacher found at dawn on the athletic field, unaware of having been there, carrying a message in a voice that had briefly replaced her own. The freshman boy who had lost 45 minutes of a Wednesday afternoon without knowing where they had gone. The dog on Elm Street, flinching from shadows no one else could see. The pattern Meredith had identified in her notebook, the progression of it, the escalating deliberateness that suggested something moving through stages rather than acting on impulse. The temperature anomalies she had recorded in her careful handwriting. The feeling Bonnie had been carrying for days, which she described again now with Stefan present, in a way that made her choose her words more carefully, because she understood that he would hear the precision of them in a way the others, for all their love and attention, could not quite match. And the communication session. Bonnie described that last because it was the heaviest thing, and because the order Meredith had established moved naturally toward it. She described reaching toward Eleanor and finding her, the connection that had formed and held long enough for something to come through, and the fragmented urgency of what had arrived. Something is coming. 2 syllables repeated, pushed through with the particular emphasis of something Eleanor had needed them to receive above everything else. When Meredith finished supplementing and the room was quiet again, Stefan remained still for a long moment. He looked at the table surface rather than at any of them, and Bonnie watched his face with the careful attention of someone who had learned that his expressions were worth reading, even when, especially when, they appeared to contain nothing. The temperature, he said finally, the cold that didn't have a meteorological source. You noticed it in the courtyard where Vicky was found, and again near the athletic field. Yes, Meredith said. That is a specific marker, Stefan said. Not of feeding, not of any power that I use or that Damon uses. It is a marker of something that operates at a different level than what you have encountered before. Something whose presence alone is enough to alter the physical environment, not as a deliberate act, but as a byproduct, the way a fire changes the temperature of a room, simply by existing in it, without choosing to. He paused. That kind of power belongs to something very old. How old? Matt asked. He asked it the way Matt asked everything important, directly and without preamble, because Matt had always understood that decorating a necessary question with careful language did not make the answer any less difficult. Stefan looked at him, and something moved through his expression that Bonnie did not have a precise name for, something that sat in the space between recognition and dread, between having known something for a long time and wishing that knowing had never been necessary. Old enough, he said, that most of what I understand about vampire power does not fully apply to it. Old enough that the rules we operate by, the limitations and the conventions, and the ways in which our world has learned to understand and govern itself were written either around something like this, or specifically in response to it. The room received that in the particular silence of people who had understood something and were deciding whether to say so aloud. You're not telling us you don't know what it is, Meredith said, reading him with the precision she brought to everything, the same precision she brought to her notebook and her pattern finding and the careful architecture of her thinking. You're telling us you know exactly what it is and you're deciding how to say it. Stefan looked at her steadily. Yes, he said, simply and without deflection. because Meredith had always been someone who deserved a direct answer. "Then say it," Matt said, not unkindly, with the particular directness of someone who had decided that the knowing was better than the not knowing, regardless of what the knowing contained. "I need to hear from Elena first," Stefan said, and his voice shifted slightly on her name in a way that was almost imperceptible and completely impossible to miss. "What she tried to tell you, what she was reaching toward in the session you described. Before I say the name I believe belongs to what is in Fell's church, I want to hear it confirmed by her. Because if I am right, then the confirmation will matter. It will tell us that what we are dealing with is precisely as serious as I believe it to be, and we will need to face that, together with full clarity rather than my assessment alone." He paused. "And if I am wrong, I don't want to have given you something to be afraid of that turns out to be misdirected fear. Fear is a resource. I don't want to waste it." Bonnie understood what he was asking before he turned to look at her. "You want me to try again tonight?" she said. "With you here?" "If you're willing," Stefan said, and the care in those 3 words was genuine, careful, the kind of consideration that did not perform itself. "And only if you feel it is safe to do so. I don't want to push you towards something that costs you more than the situation warrants." "It's not dangerous," Bonnie said, with more confidence than she entirely felt, because the honesty of her uncertainty seemed less important in this moment than the honesty of her willingness. "It's tiring. There's a hollowness afterward that takes time to fill back in, but it doesn't frighten me." She paused and amended that. "The sessions don't frighten me. What comes through them sometimes does." "Then yes," Stefan said, "if you're willing." They prepared the way they had prepared before. The lamp moved to the floor to lower the light to something softer and less intrusive. The table cleared of everything that belonged to the ordinary world. Meredith sat across from Bonnie with her notebook closed for once, setting aside the recording impulse in deference to the particular quality of attention this required. Matt positioned himself beside Bonnie in the way he always did, close enough for his warmth to be felt without touching. That simple, steady human proximity that had become one of the things Bonnie relied on without having ever said so directly. Stefan sat at the edge of the group rather than its center, which was a choice Bonnie noticed and understood. He was present. He was not inserting himself into something that had been until now, the 3 of them finding their way toward Eleanor without him. He was adding himself to it carefully, at the periphery, letting his presence be available without making it the defining element. She closed her eyes and reached. The connection formed faster than it ever had before, with a solidity that surprised her, even as she felt it happening. The thread between here and wherever Elena was thickening almost immediately into something that felt more like a rope than a thread, something with weight and durability and the capacity to carry more than fragmented impressions. She understood why as soon as she registered it. Stefan's presence on this side of the connection was doing something she had not anticipated. His love for Eleanor and his grief and the particular quality of his attention to her acting as a kind of anchor, something for the connection to be fastened to, rather than simply reaching into open space. She was not alone in the reaching. He was reaching too, in whatever way was available to him, and the combined direction of it made all the difference. Eleanor came through with a clarity that was of an entirely different order from the previous sessions. It was still Bonnie's voice that carried the words, still the strange mediated quality of a communication, passing through a human instrument from somewhere beyond the ordinary reach of human senses. But the pattern behind the words, the shape of the thought, and the particular warmth of the concern embedded in it was Eleanor, with a vividness that made Matt turn his face away briefly and made Meredith go completely still in the way she went still when something was costing her more than she intended to show. She was somewhere. She was aware of all of them, and her awareness of Stefan was of a different texture than her awareness of the others. Something in the frequency of what came through shifting when it was directed at him, becoming more concentrated, more specific, more certain of itself. The distance between them was real, and it was vast, and she felt it, that distance, as a specific and named thing. But what she felt across it for him was not diminished by it. If anything, the absence of everything incidental had clarified it, stripped it down to its essential quality, and what remained was love in its most durable and least performative form. She spoke about what had come to Fell's church. She had seen it arrive, had watched it from wherever she was, with the particular horror of someone who understood what they were seeing and could not intervene. She described the darkness of it, reaching for language that could carry the quality of what she had perceived, and what she settled on was not metaphor, but observation. It was old, she said, in a way that made everything else she had known of the vampire world seem recent. It was drawn to Fell's church by something specific, something connected to Elena herself, to the power she had carried in life, to the particular quality of what she had been that had made her extraordinary, and had therefore made her interesting to things that were drawn to the extraordinary for reasons that were not benign. And then she said the name. It came through with a precision and emphasis that told Bonnie this was what had been held in reserve. The specific thing Elena had been building toward through every fragmented session, every exhausting reach across the distance between them. The name arrived whole and deliberate and unmistakable. Klaus. Stefan's reaction was immediate and entirely involuntary, a tightening through every line of his body that went beyond the ordinary stillness of his vampire nature into something that had no control in it whatsoever. A response that had happened before his considerable capacity for self-management could intercept it. He did not move. He did not make a sound. But Bonnie felt it even through her closed eyes, felt the shift in the room's quality that was entirely attributable to what had moved through him when that name arrived. The connection held a moment longer after the name was delivered, Eleanor having given the most essential thing, and now offering what remained. And what remained was personal rather than tactical, directed at Stefan with a specificity that left no interpretive room. Warmth, certainty, the particular quality of a love that had survived everything that had been thrown at it in life and had not been diminished by death, had not been made abstract or general by the crossing of whatever threshold Eleanor had crossed, but had remained specific and named and directed at him, across everything, still. Then the connection released gently, the way sleep releases you in the morning, and Bonnie came back to herself in the low-lit room with a familiar hollowness settling in behind her temples, and Matt's presence warm beside her, and the room around her very, very quiet. Stefan had not moved. He was looking at something that was not in the room, or perhaps at something that was in the room and invisible to anyone else, and his hands rested on his knees with the careful stillness of someone who was holding themselves together with great deliberateness, attending to every point of potential fracture simultaneously, applying the same focused will to his own composure that he applied to everything he chose to do with intention. "Klaus," Meredith said quietly after a moment. Not a question, a confirmation that she had heard it, that it was now fully present among all of them, named and therefore real in a new way. "Yes," Stefan said. His voice was entirely steady, which was the most telling thing about it. "Tell us who he is," Matt said. And Stefan told them. He spoke about Klaus, the way you speak about something you have carried knowledge of for a very long time without ever expecting to encounter it directly. The way you speak about a historical catastrophe that has without warning become present tense. Klaus was ancient in a way that made the ordinary use of that word among vampires seem imprecise, inadequate to the actual scale of what it was supposed to describe. He was not old the way Stefan was old, centuries of accumulated power and experience built up through the long practice of survival. He was old in a foundational sense, present at the beginning of the vampire world as Stefan understood it. Part of whatever original darkness had given rise to their kind, and his power was not something that had been built up over time, but something that had simply always been. Like bedrock is not built, but simply underlies everything constructed above it. The rules that govern our world, Stefan said. The limitations on what vampires can and cannot do. The conventions that have developed over centuries to make coexistence possible among our kind and between our kind and humans. They were written in an awareness of what Klaus represents, not around him exactly, around the idea of him, around the knowledge that something of his nature existed and that the world required structure specifically because of what that nature was capable of. He's the reason the rules exist, Bonnie said slowly. In part, Stefan said. Yes. And now he is here, Meredith said, in Fell's church, sending messages through our classmates, testing us. He's playing, Stefan said, and the word was the most frightening thing he had said in the entire conversation, because of the way he said it. Not as a comfort, not as a suggestion that the playing was a good sign, a sign of something that could be reasoned with or managed, but as the simple and terrible description of a creature for whom playing and destroying were not opposites, but the same gesture at different stages of the same process. He is not hungry. He is not afraid. He is not in any way concerned about this town or the people in it in the way that fear or hunger would constrain a lesser vampire's behavior. He's here because something interested him enough to draw him, and now he's seeing what there is to see before he decides what to do with it. Elena, Bonnie said. He was drawn by Elena, by what she was. Yes, Stefan said quietly, what she was and what she left behind, and what is connected to her. The implication of that settled into the room and expanded to fill it. Which includes us, Matt said. Which includes you, Stefan confirmed, and looked at each of them with the full weight of what that meant visible in his eyes, the knowledge of what they were facing and the particular anguish of having brought them into proximity with it, simply by having loved Elena alongside him. I cannot face this alone. I want to be honest with you about that without any qualification, because you deserve the honesty, and because the situation requires that we be clear with each other from the beginning. Klaus is, what he can do, it is beyond what I am capable of addressing without help. He paused, and what came next cost him something visible. I need to contact Damon. The name moved through the room differently than Klaus's name had, carrying its own particular history and weight, and the complicated residue of everything Damon Salvatore was and had done, and refused to be accountable for. Matt's expression did not change, but his jaw tightened slightly. Meredith made a small notation in her notebook. That might have been anything. I know, Stefan said, reading all of it. I am not asking you to trust him. I am not certain I trust him. But against something like Klaus, I need power that I do not possess alone. And Damon has power. He stopped, and then said the rest of it, with the simplicity of something true. And he knew Elena. Whatever that means to him, whatever he will and will not admit about what she was to him, she mattered. And that may be enough to bring him back when nothing else would. Outside the windows of Meredith's house, Fell's church had gone fully dark, the streetlights doing their ordinary work against the November night. The houses settled into their evening routines, the whole quiet machinery of a small town moving through its hours in ignorance of what had gathered in one of its living rooms. Bonnie sat in the low light with the hollowness behind her eyes and the warmth of the session still faintly present at the edges of her perception. And beneath all of it, beneath the exhaustion and the fear and the enormous weight of the name they had been given tonight, something small and stubborn that she chose to call hope. Stefan was here. Elena had spoken. The thing they were facing had a name, and that meant it could, in principle, be faced. That was where you started. That was always, in the end, where you started. He did not knock. Of course he did not knock. Damon Salvatore had never in his existence announced himself through a door when a more unsettling entrance was available to him. And the habit was too old and too deeply pleasurable to abandon, simply because the circumstances had become serious. He was simply there one evening 2 days after Stefan's return, leaning against the wall of Meredith's living room with his arms crossed and his black eyes moving over the assembled group, with the particular expression he wore when he wanted you to believe he found everything faintly beneath his attention. Which meant Bonnie had learned over the course of everything they had survived together that he was paying very close attention indeed. "You all look terrible," he said, by way of greeting. Matt's jaw tightened. Meredith did not, because Meredith did not give Damon the satisfaction of visible reactions unless she had consciously decided to. Bonnie felt something complicated move through her at the sight of him, something she had long since stopped trying to examine too closely, because examining it had never led anywhere useful or comfortable. Damon was dangerous and beautiful, and occasionally unexpectedly kind in ways he immediately undermined with something cutting. And the combination of those things had always produced in her a response that defied simple categorization and resisted the kind of clean emotional labeling she preferred to apply to things. Stefan looked at his brother from across the room with the expression of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it, despite finding the immediate reality of that decision considerably more complicated than the abstract version had been. "You came," he said. "Obviously," Damon said. He pushed off from the wall with a fluid, careless grace that was as natural to him as breathing was to humans, and moved to the center of the room without being invited to, because Damon did not wait for invitations in spaces he had decided to occupy. He looked at each of them in turn, and the looking was different from Stefan's looking, less a gesture of acknowledgement, and more a rapid and thorough cataloguing of information that he processed behind eyes that revealed nothing of what he was concluding from it. Then he said, with the tone of someone settling into something they had been anticipating, "Tell me what has been happening, all of it. Leave nothing out, because you think I won't find it relevant." Meredith opened her notebook without comment, because Meredith was constitutionally incapable of dismissing an opportunity to present organized information to someone who needed it, regardless of how she felt about that person. She laid it out in the same order she had laid it out for Stefan. The incidents and the pattern and the temperature, anomalies, Bonnie's impressions and the quality of the psychic pressure that had been building, and the communication sessions with Elena. She was thorough and precise and did not editorialize, which was exactly the right approach for Damon, who would have dismissed anything that felt like emotional framing and responded only to the facts beneath it. Damon listened without the quality of deliberate attentive stillness that Stefan brought to receiving information. He listened the way a very sharp and very experienced mind listens. When it is receiving data it has been half expecting, making small visible connections as the account progressed, his expression shifting in rapid, subtle ways that were easier to track. Now that Bonnie had spent enough time watching his face to develop a working vocabulary for his particular language, a slight narrowing of the eyes when something confirmed a suspicion, a fractional tension along the jaw when something surprised him, which was rare enough to be notable when it occurred, the occasional, almost imperceptible nod that meant not agreement, but recognition, the acknowledgement of a detail that had landed in a place where something was already waiting for it. When Meredith finished, Damon was quiet for a moment that lasted approximately 4 seconds, which was long for him. Then he said, "Klaus." It was not a question. It was not even quite a statement. It was the sound of a conclusion that had been building since the first sentence of Meredith's account arriving at its natural terminus, spoken aloud less for the benefit of the room than as the final step in his own private process of confirmation. Stefan's eyes moved to his brother's face, with an expression that contained equal parts of recognition and of something that might have been relief at not having to be the one to say it first. "You knew," Stefan said. "I suspected," Damon corrected, with the precision he always applied to the distinction between what he knew and what he had concluded from available evidence, a precision that Bonnie had come to understand was one of the more genuinely reliable things about him, because Damon never claimed certainty he did not have, and never feigned uncertainty he did not feel. The pattern of the incidents, the temperature signature, the way the attacks are staged rather than spontaneous, deliberate rather than hunger-driven, each one building on the last in a sequence that has intention behind it. He paused, and something crossed his face that he did not quite manage to keep entirely from being visible before it was gone. Klaus has a signature. Everything he does carries it. You learn to recognize it if you have been paying attention to the right histories for long enough. "You've encountered him before," Meredith said. It was not quite a question, and not quite a statement, occupying the precise middle ground that Meredith used when she wanted information and understood that a direct question would produce a deflection. Not directly, Damon said. I have encountered what he leaves behind, the aftermath of him, the residue of his presence in places he has passed through, the specific quality of what remains after he has done what he came to do. He stopped and looked at his own hand for a moment in a way that seemed almost unconscious. A brief downward glance that lasted less than a second before he raised his eyes again. That is sufficient to constitute knowledge. In some respect, it is more informative than a direct encounter, because the aftermath reveals what the presence conceals. He moved to the window and stood with his back to the room, looking out at the dark street below, and the quality of that turn back was subtly different from his usual performance of disinterest. The usual performance had a lightness to it, an ease, the posture of someone who had decided the room behind him was not worth facing. This was different. This was the posture of someone giving themselves a moment they did not particularly want to be observed needing, a brief and private recalibration before turning back to face what needed to be faced. Stefan has told you what Klaus is, he said, his voice carrying clearly over his shoulder without requiring him to turn. The age of him, the particular category of power he represents. Yes, Bonnie said. Then you understand that what we are dealing with does not respond to conventional approaches. He turned back, and whatever had been briefly visible in the angle of his shoulders was gone, replaced by the familiar cool and composed surface of him. What has he done specifically? Not the general shape of it. I want the particulars. They gave him the particulars. Matt described the teacher on the athletic field, the words she had delivered in a borrowed voice, and the absence of any memory afterward. Meredith read from her notebook the sequence and spacing of the incidents, the precise progression she had mapped. And Bonnie described what she had felt in the residue of the attacks, the quality she had struggled to name accurately and had eventually landed on as amusement, enormous and cold and patient, an indifference that was somehow more frightening than direct malice, because malice at least implied that you registered as a threat worth hating. Damon listened to her description of the residue with a focus that was different from the focus he had given to Meredith's organized account. He was listening to the feeling of it, receiving her psychic impression as a specific and credible form of data in a way that suggested, without his ever saying so, that he gave those impressions considerably more weight than his surface manner typically implied. Amused, he said when she finished. You are certain of that quality, not simply indifferent, nor contemptuous, specifically amused. Yes, Bonnie said, there is a difference, and what I felt was the second thing. Damon nodded slowly, the nod of someone receiving a confirmation they had already constructed a framework around, slotting the final piece into a structure that had been waiting for it. Then he is not here for an immediate endgame, he said. He is in the early stages of something he has decided will be entertaining, which means we have time, but not the kind of time that permits anything resembling complacency. He looked at Stefan with an expression that was stripped of its usual performance, direct and serious in a way that Damon permitted himself rarely and only when he had decided it was strictly necessary. He will escalate. He always escalates. The amusement is not a stable condition for him. It has a trajectory, and the trajectory has always moved in the same direction. How do you know his patterns well enough to predict his trajectory? Matt asked. The question was direct, but not hostile. carrying the honest, uncomplicated desire to understand. That was Matt's particular gift. The ability to ask difficult things without making them sound like accusations. Damon looked at him for a moment with an expression that was assessing without being unkind. Because I've spent a very long time paying deliberate attention to things that most vampires prefer not to think about, he said. The ancient histories, the names that appear at the beginnings of stories that end very badly, the patterns that repeat across centuries because the things producing them are old enough to have settled into patterns and powerful enough that nothing has yet interrupted them. He paused. Klaus is one of those things. Knowing what he is and how he moves felt, for most of my existence, like the kind of knowledge that would never become relevant. The kind you accumulate anyway, because you cannot be certain what will matter. He looked around the room at each of them in turn. That moment of relevance appears to have arrived. The room held the silence of people sorting through a great deal of difficult information, finding the connective tissue between pieces, identifying the gaps that still needed filling. "We need Elena," Stefan said. He said it quietly and without preamble, because there was no way to say it that was not simply the saying of it. Damon turned his head toward his brother, and the movement was very controlled and very deliberate. The movement of someone who had been waiting for those specific words and had prepared himself for them, and was now discovering that the preparation had been inadequate. He said nothing. The silence he produced in response was not the empty silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the dense and pressurized silence of someone choosing with great care what to do with what was happening inside them. "She's been reaching us," Stefan continued, watching his brother's face with an attention that was not clinical, but deeply personal, reading something in Damon's reaction that the others could perceive but not fully decode. Bonnie has been making contact. The connection has been growing stronger with each session. "She's been trying to warn us from the beginning," Bonnie said. And she said it because something in the quality of Damon's silence made her want to give him the full picture of it, the scope and the effort and the care behind it. Before we understood what was happening, before we had a name for it, she was already reaching. She knew about Klaus before any of us did. She's been spending whatever she has from wherever she's trying to make sure we were not caught unprepared. Damon turned back to the window. He stood there for a long moment with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face hidden from the room. And the stillness of him was different from his usual stillness. Less the controlled stillness of someone managing their presentation and more the stillness of someone who has momentarily stopped managing and is simply standing inside something too large to perform around. "I want to be present for the next session," he said finally. His voice was entirely level. It gave away nothing and everything simultaneously in the particular way that total control gives away the effort it is costing. "All right," Bonnie said, without hesitation and without making anything of it, because making something of it was not what he needed. He turned back from the window and was himself again, or the version of himself he chose to show, the sharp and composed intelligence that was his default armor. "In the meantime," he said, "we need to discuss what we know about Klaus's particular vulnerability, because every strategy we might develop is structurally meaningless without that foundation. Every creature has a weakness. Klaus's is specific to his nature, and it is not located where most people who know of him would think to look, because finding it requires understanding not what he is now, but what he was before the process that made him. Which is what, precisely, Meredith asked, her pen ready. The originals are not simply very old vampires, Damon said, settling into the explanation with a particular quality of someone who has organized this knowledge many times privately and is now delivering it to people who need it rather than keeping it for the theoretical future he had always assumed would never come. The process of their creation involves something that the later creation of vampires, the way Stefan was made, the way I was made, did not. Something that predated the systems and structures of our world as we understand it. The conventional vampire creation is one thing layered on top of a human foundation. What was done to the originals reached deeper than that. It touched something more fundamental, and that fundamental thing is both the source of what makes Klaus what he is and the location of what can reach him. Because the thing that created him is the only category of force capable of operating at the level where he exists. And what category of force is that? Matt asked. Damon looked at Bonnie when he answered, not at Matt, who had asked the question. At Bonnie. Something that exists at the boundary between this world and what lies beyond it, he said. Something that is not vampire power, not human strength, not anything that operates within the conventional structures of either world. Something that moves between those structures. He held her gaze steadily. Something that a certain kind of person carries without fully understanding yet what they are carrying. Bonnie felt the weight of that land in her with the particular heaviness of something she had known was coming toward her without knowing its specific shape. She did not say anything. She held his gaze and let the information settle. Elena may be able to confirm this, Stefan said. She may have information from her vantage point that we cannot access from here, about the vulnerability specifically, about how it can be reached. Yes, Damon said, which is why the session matters. They prepared the room that evening. The lamp moved, the light lowered, the world outside set at a slight distance. Damon positioned himself at the furthest point from the center of the room that still constituted being present in it, standing near the far wall with his arms at his sides rather than crossed, which Bonnie registered as the most undefended posture she had ever seen him adopt. He was there. He was not inserting himself. He was allowing himself to be present in the only way he knew how to allow it, at the periphery, available but not claiming the center of something that was not his to claim. Bonnie closed her eyes and reached, and the connection formed with the solidity she had come to associate with sessions where multiple people who had loved Elena were present in the room, the love functioning as an anchor in a way she was increasingly convinced was a principle rather than a coincidence. The thread thickened almost immediately into something that felt structural, capable of carrying real weight, and she followed it with everything she had. Elena came through with a clarity that was the best they had yet achieved. Sustained and specific, the signal holding without the fragmentation of the early sessions, delivering information with a precision that suggested she had been organizing it in the waiting, preparing the most important things in the most durable form she could construct for the crossing. She had been watching. She had seen Klaus arrive, had understood from her vantage point exactly what had drawn him and what he intended, and she had been reaching toward the living with increasing urgency ever since, building toward this moment, toward the clarity that a full session with all of them present finally made possible. She described Klaus's vulnerability with the focused care of someone who had been given access to knowledge she had not possessed in life. The broader view that her current position afforded, the ability to see the architecture of things that had been invisible from inside the living world. The vulnerability was in the origin, in the specific act of her original creation, and the force that had made it possible. What could reach Klaus operated at that foundational level, predating and therefore underlying everything he had become since. It was not power in the conventional sense. It was something older and stranger and less defined, something that lived at the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. Something that moved between the known and the unknown with a fluency that conventional power could not match. Something that lived, she said, in people like Bonnie, in the particular lineage of psychic ability that Bonnie carried, that her grandmother had carried before her, that stretched back through generations of women in her family who had moved between worlds without fully belonging to either. The ability to reach across the boundary, to communicate with what lay beyond it, to bring something of that beyond back into the living world. That was the category of force that could reach Klaus, not to destroy him through strength, because strength was his territory, and he had been occupying it for longer than any of them had existed, but to reach the thing beneath his power, the original wound of his creation, and address it at the level where it actually lived. The connection held a moment longer after that, and what came through in the final passage of it was not information, but the specific warmth that had come to define these sessions at their close. Elena's love for each of them moving through the connection with the particular quality of something that knew it was about to end and was making full use of the remaining time. It moved towards Stefan with the depth and specificity of everything they had been to each other, everything they had survived and chosen and lost and held on to anyway. It moved toward Matt with the warmth of years and trust and the particular love of someone who had known you before you knew yourself. It moved toward Meredith with the precise and lasting affection of a friendship that had contained more truth than most relationships manage in a lifetime. And then it moved toward the far wall where Damon stood. Bonnie felt it happen more than she observed it. The connection orienting toward him, finding him, reaching with a deliberateness that was entirely Elena, the specific quality of her attention, when she had decided something mattered and was giving it everything she had. And what it carried toward him was not the warmth of friendship or the gratitude of someone who had been saved. It was something more complicated and more honest than either of those things. Something that acknowledged the full truth of what he was and what he had done and what he had felt and had never said, and met all of it without flinching, without reduction, without the comfortable simplification that love sometimes reaches for when the real thing is too large and too contradictory to hold cleanly. It saw him. That was what it did, completely and without condition, and it was not diminished by what it saw. What happened in Damon when it reached him was contained entirely within the architecture of his stillness. He did not move. His face did not change in any way that could have been described or recorded. But Bonnie felt the shift in him, the peripheral awareness she had been developing telling her clearly that something enormous had moved behind the surface of him. Something that had been pressed against the door for a very long time and had felt briefly the door give slightly before it was held shut again by a will that was practiced and relentless and very, very tired. He turned his face a fraction toward the window. The angle was slight enough that anyone not watching carefully would not have noticed. Bonnie noticed. It was the gesture of someone turning from a light that was brighter than they had prepared themselves for, brighter than they had believed it would be, brighter than they had perhaps allowed themselves to believe anything could be. The connection released, slowly and gently, the way a held breath releases when the body finally decides it has waited long enough. Bonnie came back to herself and opened her eyes, and the room was very quiet. She looked at Damon. He was composed in every visible way, every surface of him arranged with the careful precision of long practice. He met her eyes for a single moment, and in that moment she saw something she had no adequate language for, something that was vast and unacknowledged and entirely real. And then it was gone, and he looked away and said, in a voice of complete and practiced normalcy, "Well, now we know what we're working with." "Yes," Meredith said, very softly. "Then we have work to do," Damon said. And the conversation moved forward because it had to, because Elena would have wanted it to, because the information she had delivered was a gift that demanded to be used rather than simply held. But something had changed in the room in the way that real things change, quietly and permanently, and without requiring anyone's permission. And Bonnie held it carefully as the others began to speak, keeping it somewhere safe inside herself where it would last. The shift from reactive to active happened quietly, the way most significant shifts happen, not in a single declared moment, but through the accumulation of small decisions that collectively amounted to a change in direction. It was Meredith who named it first, sitting at her desk on a Tuesday morning with her notebook open to a fresh page and her pen moving with the particular purposefulness she brought to things she had already decided about before she began speaking about them. "We have been waiting to understand what is happening," she said, without looking up from the page. "We understand it now, which means waiting is no longer the appropriate response." No one disagreed. There was nothing to disagree with. The research began that same afternoon, spreading across Meredith's kitchen table in the organized but gradually expanding way that serious research always spreads, starting with clear boundaries and then overflowing them as the material accumulated and the connections between pieces multiplied. Meredith organized it the way she organized everything, with a clear taxonomy of what they knew, what they suspected, and what they needed to find out. Each category assigned its own section of a new notebook, purchased specifically for this purpose. The known column was shorter than any of them would have liked. The suspected column was longer and more troubling. The needed column was the longest of all, a list that kept growing rather than shrinking, as each answer generated 3 new questions, which was uncomfortable but honest. And Meredith had always preferred the discomfort of honesty to the false reassurance of pretending a situation was more manageable than it actually was. Stefan contributed to the research in the way that only someone with centuries of accumulated experience could contribute. Not through documents or sources that could be cross-referenced and formally cited, but through memory. He sat with them at the kitchen table on the first evening of organized research and spoke about Klaus, the way an archivist speaks about a collection they have spent a very long time cataloguing, each detail retrieved with care and placed precisely in relation to the others, nothing embellished and nothing minimized. The whole account building toward a picture that was more disturbing in its completeness than any individual piece of it had been in isolation. He spoke about the vampire world's oral histories, the accounts passed down through covens and bloodlines across centuries, the stories that older vampires told younger ones, not as entertainment or mythology, but as practical warning. The ways sailors once told each other about specific stretches of water where ships had been lost, specific conditions under which the sea became something other than what it ordinarily was. Klaus appeared in those stories, the way certain names appear in the oldest human myths, not as a character within the narrative who did things and experienced consequences, but as the force around which the narrative organized itself, the gravitational center that determined the shape of everything else, whether it acknowledged him directly or not. He had been present, Stefan explained, at the formation of the vampire world's earliest governing structures, not as a participant in the building of those structures, not as someone who had sat at a table and negotiated terms and signed compacts, rather as the reason they had needed to be built at all. The ancient agreements between vampire factions that had made coexistence possible across centuries had been written with a continuous awareness of what Klaus represented. The knowledge that something of his nature and power existed, and that the world required order and structure specifically because of what that nature was capable of when unaddressed. He was not simply old, he was originary, present at the moment when the vampire world had first understood that it needed rules, and his existence was the argument those rules had been written to answer. The laws existed because of Klaus, and Klaus observed none of them, which was either the founding contradiction of the vampire world's governance or its most honest acknowledgement of its own limitations, depending on how you chose to look at it. He must have vanity, Damon said on the second evening, arriving in the kitchen unannounced as he always did, at the precise moment when his contribution would be most disruptive to any sense the others had developed of managing without him, and inserting himself into the conversation at the point where it was most useful to him. He had been in the hallway, Bonnie suspected, long enough to understand what thread needed to be picked up. He settled into a chair with the ease of someone who had not been invited and did not require it. Everything of his age does. The older a thing becomes, the more completely it has become itself. And the more completely it has become itself, the more sensitive it is to any suggestion that what it is might be insufficient, or that something in the world might exist outside its comprehension. Vanity is not the same as pride, and the distinction matters practically. Pride can be managed, redirected, appealed to through the right framing. Vanity is structural. It is load-bearing. Remove it, and everything constructed on top of it becomes unstable in ways that the thing itself cannot fully compensate for, because it has been relying on that load-bearing vanity for so long, it has forgotten how to stand without it. How do we use that? Matt asked, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, his expression carrying the focused, practical attention he brought to things he had decided mattered. You make him look at you, Damon said. You make him decide that you are worth his full and personal attention, rather than the peripheral amusement he has been extending to you so far. which requires being interesting enough to deserve it, which is its own particular challenge given what interesting means to something like Klaus, and what it has historically cost the things that succeeded in being interesting to him. He already finds us interesting, Bonnie said. That's what the incidents have been about. The testing, the staged attacks. He's been studying us. He finds the situation interesting, Damon corrected, with the precision he applied to distinctions that mattered tactically, even when they seemed semantic. Eleanor, what she was, the particular configuration of love and power that produced the events of this autumn, the fact that humans knew about vampires and survived that knowledge and were changed by it rather than destroyed by it. That interests him as a phenomenon. What we need is for him to find the opposition interesting, for him to conclude that what stands against him constitutes a genuine challenge rather than an entertaining obstacle he can address at his leisure. Because a Klaus who is amused is unpredictable and therefore difficult to anticipate. A Klaus who has decided something represents a real threat is at least oriented, and orientation, even in something as powerful as Klaus, creates patterns that can be read. You want to provoke him? Meredith said, her pen pausing above her notebook. I want to control the terms of the engagement, Damon said, which may require provocation as a means to that end. They are not the same objective, though they can appear similar from the outside, and the distinction between them is the difference between strategy and recklessness. The intelligence gathering that followed took 3 days and required sources that extended well beyond what any of them could access through memory or conventional research. Darman disappeared for 2 of those days without explanation or apology, which was consistent with his established pattern of behavior and provoked no surprise from anyone who knew him. Only the particular quality of waiting that his absences always produced. The awareness that he would return when he had what he had gone to find, and not before. He returned on the 3rd evening with a quality of focus compression that was different from his usual controlled composure. Something that had been pressed tighter by whatever the previous 48 hours had required of him. He did not explain where he had been. He did not name his sources or describe the means by which he had accessed them, and no one asked, partly because asking was unlikely to produce honest answers, and partly because the information itself was more immediately important than its provenance. He sat down and told them what he had learned, and the specificity of it, the precision of detail that could only have come from something direct rather than inferential, made clear that whatever he had done in those 2 days had been neither comfortable nor without cost. Klaus had established a presence at a specific location at the edge of Fells Church's geographic boundary, where the town gave way to forest, and the forest thickened into the kind of old growth that had been there long enough to have its own character, distinct from the managed woodland closer to the inhabited areas. The location was not arbitrary. It sat at a confluence in the natural geography, a point where something in the land itself created a particular kind of intersection, an accumulated quality of place that had been there long before Klaus arrived, and that he had recognized and chosen deliberately, the way an experienced craftsman recognizes the right material immediately upon encountering it. He had not chosen it for concealment. What Klaus was doing in Fells Church did not require concealment from anything the town contained. He had chosen it because it amplified something in him, fed something that the ordinary human landscape of the town could not sustain, a depth of power that required a particular kind of ground beneath it. "We need to see it," Stefan said, when Damon had finished describing the location. "Before we can plan anything further, we need to understand what we are actually dealing with in a direct, rather than a described way." "Agreed," Damon said. "Stefan and I will go first, alone." Bonnie began to object, and then stopped herself, because the objection, when she examined it honestly, was not about the reasonableness of the plan, but about the discomfort of waiting, and discomfort was not a sufficient tactical argument. Stefan and Damon moving through the forest together, two vampires with centuries of combined experience and the particular dark fluency that came from having survived everything they had survived, were genuinely more capable of observing the location without triggering a response than any configuration that included humans. The reconnaissance made sense. She accepted it. They waited in Meredith's kitchen, which had become the de facto center of operations in the way that certain spaces become essential to certain efforts, not because they are ideally suited to the purpose, but because they are where the people involved feel most capable of being honest with each other. Meredith made tea that they actually drank this time, which Bonnie noted as evidence that something had shifted in all of them. Some threshold of crisis had been crossed into a territory where the body's ordinary needs reasserted themselves even in the middle of extraordinary circumstances. Matt sat with his hands around his mug and said very little, which was Matt's particular form of presence, and had always been one of the things Bonnie found most steadying about him. He was there. He did not perform being there. He simply was. Stefan and Damon returned 2 hours before dawn. The quality of their return communicated more than the words that followed it. Stefan sat down immediately upon entering the kitchen, with the deliberate care of someone applying a practiced skill at greater than usual intensity, because the situation required it. Damon remained standing near the doorway and looked at the wall for a moment with an expression that was controlled and informative in its very control, in the particular quality of effort visible in the maintenance of it. Then he turned and began to speak. What they had found was not a direct encounter with Klaus. It was his presence in his fullest and most unmodulated form, and the difference between the attended expression of what Klaus was and the unattended one was significant in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated. When Klaus moved through Fell's church, through the school and the streets and the ordinary human spaces of the town, he wore something over his nature. Not a disguise, not the careful performance of humanity that Stefan and Damon both maintained in public spaces, but a modulation, a reduction of what he was to a level that the human environment could accommodate, without the accommodation itself becoming visible, without the space breaking under the weight of what it was being asked to contain. At the chosen location, with no humans present and no performance required, he wore nothing over it. "The temperature drops at the boundary," Stefan said, his voice steady and informative in the particular register he used when managing something large by focusing on its reportable dimensions. "Approximately 10 degrees consistently, regardless of the ambient conditions outside the boundary. It is immediate rather than gradual. One step there is the temperature of the November night. The next step is something different." He paused. The light changes inside as well, not simply darker, but altered in its quality. The way light changes in the minutes before a very significant storm, that particular quality of pressure and wrongness, the sense that the light itself is aware of what is about to happen and is adjusting. The sound of the forest stops at the boundary. Every ordinary acoustic element, the animals, the wind through the trees, the particular ambient texture of living woodland at night, ceases. Inside the boundary there is silence, but it is not natural silence. Natural silence is the absence of sound. This is the presence of something that has displaced sound. Damon took over the account with the particular precision of a military report. Each observation stated once, clearly, without elaboration beyond what was necessary for accuracy. Klaus had constructed the space over time, not in a single act but through accumulated presence. The way certain people alter the character of a room simply by spending enough time in it, except that what Klaus had altered was not a room, but a section of forest, and what he had altered it with was not personality, but power of a foundational order. The wildlife avoided the area, not in the cautious way of animals avoiding a predator's territory, with the nervous circling and the occasional tentative approach that characterized ordinary territorial avoidance. They avoided it absolutely, with the unambiguous instinctive rejection of something that the animal nervous system recognizes as outside the category of manageable threats, outside even the category of threats that can be assessed and responded to, simply and completely wrong in a way that produces immediate and total avoidance. He knew we were there, Damon said. I want to be clear about that. He was present throughout our observation, not physically visible, but present in a way that was not designed to be subtle. He allowed us to see what we saw. He made the choice to let us observe rather than respond. He looked around the room at each of them, which means the observation was itself a communication. He is telling us that he has nothing to fear from anything we might learn from seeing what he is. He is telling us that our knowledge of him cannot be converted into threat by anything we are capable of doing with it. He is wrong about that, Bonnie said. She had not planned to say it. The words arrived before the conscious decision to speak, carried on the same current of certainty that had been building in her since Elena's disclosure, since her own first peripheral contact with the foundational thing beneath Klaus's power, since the growing understanding of what she carried and what it was for. But when she traced the certainty back to its source, what she found there was solid and genuine, not bravado and not wishful thinking. Yes, Damon said, looking at her directly and without the layering of irony that characterized most of his direct looks. He is. They went the following night, all 5 of them, because the reconnaissance phase was complete, and what came next required everyone. The formation through the forest had become natural over the previous weeks, the product of practice and the accumulated learning of how to move together in circumstances where the stakes of poor coordination were significant. Stefan ranged ahead, Damon to the left flank where the trees were thickest, and the approach from that direction most likely, Matt and Meredith in the center, where the human presence was least exposed, and Bonnie between them and Stefan, close enough to the front to reach with her perception, but with the steadiness of her friends immediately available behind her. Bonnie felt the boundary before they reached it. The change in the air arrived as a physical sensation, a drop in temperature against her exposed face and hands that was distinct from the ambient cold of the night in its quality as much as its degree. The difference between the cold of weather and the cold of something that had decided to be cold, that was cold as an expression of its nature, rather than as a consequence of atmospheric conditions. She stopped walking without a conscious decision to stop, her body registering what lay ahead before her mind had completed the process of interpreting the sensory information. And Meredith stopped half a step later with the responsiveness of someone who had learned over months of crisis to treat Bonnie's physical signals as reliable data worth attending to. "Here," Bonnie said. They stood at the boundary and she extended her perception outward with a deliberate and practiced openness she had been developing since the first communication session with Elena, since she had begun to understand that her psychic ability was not simply the capacity to receive impressions, but the capacity to reach, to extend herself across distances that were not always geographic, to meet things halfway across whatever separated them. She reached into the space ahead without crossing into it physically, reading the quality of what was there from the outside before committing to entry. The way you test the surface of ice before trusting your weight to it. What she felt was enormous. That was the first and most encompassing quality of it. A scale that made her own perception feel very small in comparison. Not diminished exactly, not overwhelmed, but made aware of its own dimensions against something that had none of the usual dimensions. The coldness of it was not temperature. The cold she had felt on her skin was a secondary effect, a physical translation of something that did not exist primarily in the physical register. What Klaus had constructed in this space was a form of presence that had been organized over time into something stable and self-sustaining, a darkness that had been arranged rather than accumulated, deliberate rather than incidental. It had structure the way a building has structure, internal logic and load-bearing elements, and the particular coherence of something that had been built to last. And beneath it, beneath the arrangement, beneath the organized expression of power that Klaus had constructed and inhabited, she felt the other thing, the older thing, the foundational material of which he was made, the original substance that predated everything he had built on top of it, across his centuries of existence. It was not power in the same sense as what surrounded it. It was something stranger and more primary, the way bedrock is stranger and more primary than the buildings constructed above it, present in a way that the buildings are not present, elemental where they are constructed. She reached toward it with the part of herself that lived at the boundary between the living world and what lay beyond it, the part that had reached toward Elena across that boundary and found her, the part her grandmother had named, and she had only recently begun to claim consciously and with intention, rather than stumbling into it accidentally in moments of crisis. She moved that part of herself toward the foundational thing beneath Klaus's power, with the careful deliberateness of someone extending a hand toward something they do not fully understand but recognize as important. The contact, when it came, was not what she had prepared herself for. She had prepared for resistance. She had prepared for the response of something that recognized the threat approaching its most essential self and moved to repel it, the closing of a fist around something that had reached too close, the slamming of a door against an intrusion. What she felt instead was the precise opposite of resistance, a terrible and complete receptiveness, as though the thing she had touched had been waiting for exactly this category of contact, as though it had been waiting for a very long time, as though the wound of Klaus's original creation had never fully closed in the centuries since it was made, and what Bonnie carried in her particular lineage of psychic ability was the first thing in all those centuries that belonged to the right category to reach it. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds before she pulled back, breaking it with deliberate care, withdrawing the extended part of herself back within her own boundaries before the receptiveness could deepen into something she was not yet equipped to manage. Her heart was beating very fast, the physical adrenaline of having touched something that large and that old expressing itself in her body with the straightforward honesty of pure biology. Meredith's hand was on her arm, which meant Meredith had felt the change in her, even through the silence of the external observation. "Are you all right?" Meredith asked, in the quiet, controlled voice she used when she was genuinely frightened and was applying her discipline to the management of it. "Yes," Bonnie said. She took a breath and steadied herself and looked at Damon, who was watching her with a full, focused attention of someone who understood exactly what had just occurred and was processing its implications at a speed she could not match. "I found it," she said. "What Elena described, what you both suspected. It's there, underneath everything else, and it recognized what I am. Not me specifically, but what I carry, the category of ability. It responded to it." Damon was silent for a moment, his black eyes steady on her face. Then he said, simply, and without any of his usual ornamentation, "I know." "Can you reach it fully?" Stefan asked. "Not the peripheral contact. A complete and sustained reach, enough to actually work with what's there rather than simply confirm its location." "Not yet," Bonnie said. She said it without apology or performance, a simple, honest assessment. "I touched the edge of it. I understand what it is and where it is and that I can reach it. But doing something with that reach, using it with intention and control rather than simply making contact, that requires more than I currently have." She paused. "More practice, more understanding of what I'm working with." Another pause. "More time." "How much time?" Matt asked, from his position just behind her right shoulder, steady and close in the way he had been throughout. Bonnie considered the question honestly. "I don't know," she said, "but not so much that we can't afford it, and not so little that we can rush." They stood at the boundary for another few minutes, while Stefan and Damon consulted in the quiet, rapid way of people who'd been having the same underlying conversation for centuries and had developed a compressed vocabulary for it, communicating in the shorthand of shared history. What emerged from that consultation was the beginning of a plan, not complete and not refined, but structured around the central fact that Bonnie had just confirmed. The vulnerability was real, it was accessible to her specifically, and what needed to happen next was the development of her ability to reach it with enough control and intention to use it deliberately rather than simply touching it and withdrawing. On the walk back through the forest, the trees closing around them again, as they moved away from the boundary and its particular quality of wrongness, Matt fell into step beside Bonnie with the quiet ease of long familiarity. They walked in silence for a while, which was one of the things she valued most about his company, his understanding that silence could be companionable rather than empty, that the presence of another person did not always require filling with words. "Whatever the next part asks of you," he said eventually, not looking at her but at the path ahead. "You're not doing it alone. That matters. I need you to actually believe that, not just nod at it." Bonnie looked at him, at his steady profile and the uncomplicated quality of his courage, the kind that did not announce itself or require acknowledgement, the kind that simply showed up and continued showing up regardless of what it was asked to face. "I believe it," she said. "Good," he said, and they walked on. Behind them, at the edge of the living forest, where the boundary of Klaus's constructed space pressed against the ordinary world, something ancient and patient registered their departure. It had watched them come and watched them probe and watched them withdraw, and it had found the entire sequence of it, as it found everything about them interesting. The girl with the red hair and the extended perception had touched something she should not have been able to touch, should not have had the nature to access, and the fact of it was being catalogued alongside everything else the ancient presence had been gathering since it arrived in Fell's church. It was still amused, but the quality of the amusement had shifted very slightly, in a direction that an observer sufficiently familiar with the history of that amusement would have recognized as the first faint movement toward something more serious. Not concern, not fear, something closer to the feeling of a game becoming more interesting than anticipated. The pleasure of discovering that the pieces on the board had more capability than their initial presentation had suggested, somewhere beyond the boundary of the living world, in the place of significant light where the dead could sometimes see further than the living. Elena Gilbert was watching. She had seen Bonnie touch the foundational thing and withdraw. She had felt the contact through whatever connection existed between them, felt its quality and its potential, and the distance that remained between what Bonnie could currently do and what the situation would ultimately require. She had been working on that distance from her side of it for some time now. She would continue working on it. The people she loved were moving towards something enormous, and she was moving toward it from the other direction, and the place where those two movements would eventually meet was the place where everything would be decided. She had faith in what would be found there. She had always had faith in the people she loved. That had not changed. If anything, where she was now had clarified it, the way distance and elevation clarify a landscape that was too close and too detailed to be fully readable from inside it. She could see them more completely from here. And what she saw, in all its fragile and determined and completely human courage, was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. The sessions had become a kind of discipline, a practice in the truest sense of that word, something that required daily attention and the particular quality of repetition that builds not just skill, but endurance, the capacity to do a difficult thing, not once under ideal conditions, but consistently under whatever conditions presented themselves. Bonnie had been reaching toward Elena every evening for nearly 2 weeks since the visit to the boundary, and each session was different from the one before it in ways that were small but cumulative. The connection a little more durable, her control over the extended part of herself a little more precise, the distance between what she could currently do and what the situation required a little shorter than it had been the day before. She did not always tell the others everything she felt during these sessions. not because she was concealing anything important, but because some of what she was experiencing in the reaching did not yet have adequate language, existed in the space between sensation and understanding where things lived before they could be reported. She was learning something about the nature of her own ability that she had not known before, that it was not a fixed quantity with defined edges, but something that grew in response to demand, that extended itself further the more consistently it was asked to extend, the way a muscle responds to training not by changing its nature, but by becoming more fully what it already was. Stefan was present for most of the sessions. He sat in the same position he had occupied since the first evening he had joined them, at the periphery rather than the center, adding his presence to the room without claiming it, his love for Elena functioning as the anchor that Bonnie had come to rely on without always acknowledging aloud. Damon attended less consistently, arriving some evenings and not others, never explaining his absence and never explaining his presence, simply there or not there according to whatever private calculus governed his movements. But Bonnie had noticed that on the evenings he was present, the sessions went deeper, the connection was stronger, the clarity of what came through higher, as though Eleanor, on her side of the boundary, could feel the difference in what was available to her and used it accordingly. On the 14th evening, something was different from the moment Bonnie closed her eyes. She could not have described the difference in advance, could not have identified it as distinct before it had fully expressed itself. It was a quality in the reaching, a quality in what came back in response to the reaching, something that was not the gradual improvement of the previous sessions, but a change in kind rather than degree. The thread she had been building and strengthening over 2 weeks felt in the first moments of extension less like a thread and more like an opening, as though the repeated reaching had worn something thin that had previously been thick, had worked at a barrier through consistent pressure until the barrier had become permeable in a way it hadn't been before. She followed the opening with the careful attention of someone who understands that the unfamiliar requires more rather than less precision, reaching through rather than toward, moving into a quality of contact that had no precedent in any of the previous sessions. It felt like stepping through a doorway rather than pressing against a wall. It felt like arriving somewhere rather than reaching towards something. And then Elena was there, not as she had been in the previous sessions, not as a presence at a great distance pressing its intention through a medium that changed everything it carried, not as the impression of a voice or the emotional signature of a thought translated across the boundary into something Bonnie's perception could receive. She was there in the room, or something so close to that as to make the distinction functionally meaningless, present with a vividness and a specificity and a completeness that made every previous session feel like a photograph of a person compared to the person themselves. She was luminous. That was the word, and it was not a metaphor. There was a quality of light in her presence that was not the ordinary light of the room or the lamplight from the floor, something that she carried with her from wherever she had been, something that had become part of what she was in the time since her death. She was also changed in ways that were harder to name, not different in the sense of being unrecognizable, not altered so fundamentally that the Elena of before was absent, but deepened, as though what she had always been had been given more space to become fully itself, as though the particular qualities that had made her extraordinary in life had been clarified rather than diminished by what had happened since. Bonnie opened her eyes, and Eleanor was there, and the room was absolutely still. Meredith made a sound that she would never have made in any other circumstances. A soft, involuntary intake of breath that came from somewhere beneath all her practiced composure, from the place inside her that had been grieving quietly and without complaints in September, and now felt something it had not allowed itself to anticipate. Matt had both hands flat on the table in front of him, pressing down against the surface as though he needed the grounding of something solid, his face open in a way it almost never was. The careful management of his expression completely abandoned in the face of something his management had not been built to accommodate. Stefan rose from his chair. He did it slowly, the movement containing everything that had accumulated in him since the evening in the hospital, when he had understood that she was gone. Every day of the weeks that had followed, every session in this room where her presence had come through in fragments that were simultaneously a comfort and a form of grief, because they were not this, were not her fully present and specific and real in the way she was real right now. He crossed the room with the careful deliberateness of someone who does not trust themselves to move quickly, who understands that speed might shatter something, and when he reached her, when he was close enough that the luminous quality of her reached him directly rather than across the room, he stopped. They looked at each other. What passed between them in that looking was not available to the others in the room, not in any complete sense, not in any way that language could have carried accurately, even if anyone had been attempting to describe it. It was everything that their particular story had contained, the impossible beginning of it, and the terrible middle, and the cost of every choice both of them had made. The love that had persisted through all of it, not despite its difficulty, but in some way that neither of them had ever been able to fully explain, because of it, shaped by it, proven by it. She reached out and touched his face, her hand against his cold cheek, and the gesture was so recognizable, so completely Elena in its particular tenderness, that Bonnie felt tears on her own face without knowing when they had started. "Stefan," Elena said. Her voice was her own, not the mediated version that had come through Bonnie in the previous sessions, not the impression of her voice translated by someone else's instrument, but her actual voice, present in the actual air of the room, carrying the specific timbre and warmth that had always been hers. "Elena," he said, and the word contained everything his expression had not been able to hold. They held each other with the careful intensity of people who understand that what they have is temporary and are determined to be completely present in it, rather than spending any of it anticipating its end. Stefan's arms around her and her face against his chest, and the particular stillness of them together. A stillness that was different from Stefan's usual vampire stillness, because it was chosen rather than characteristic. A deliberate pause in everything to simply be in. This moment that should not have been possible, and was. After a time, Elena lifted her head and looked at the others, and the smile that crossed her face was so entirely her, so specifically and recognizably the Elena who had walked these streets and loved these people and been the center of gravity around which so much had organized itself, that Meredith made the sound again, the small involuntary one, and this time did not seem to be aware she had made it. Meredith, Elena said warmly, and Meredith straightened in her chair and met Elena's eyes with the full directness she gave everything, not flinching from the reality of it, accepting the impossibility of what was happening with the composed grace that was her particular strength. "You look different," Meredith said, which was probably not what she had intended to say first, and was completely characteristic of her in its honesty. "I am different," Elena said simply, "but I am still me. That matters. I need you to know that." She looked at Matt, who had not moved from his position at the table, with his hands flat against the surface. "Matt." "Hey," Matt said, and his voice came out rough in a way he did not attempt to smooth. The rawness of it honest and uncomplicated, entirely Matt. "You look good. Wherever you've been, it agrees with you." Elena laughed, and the sound of it moved through the room like something physical, like the quality of the air changed in response to it, and Bonnie felt the tears on her face move faster and did not do anything about them, because there was nothing to do about them, and they were correct. Then Elena looked toward the far wall where Damon stood, and the room understood simultaneously that this moment had been present in everything she had done since arriving, had been the destination of her attention since the first second, contained and patient beneath everything else, in the same way that the most important thing in a room is sometimes the one that waits longest to be addressed. Damon had not moved since Eleanor had become fully present in the room. He stood against the far wall in the position he had occupied when the session began, arms at his sides, and the quality of his stillness was not his usual stillness, was not the controlled and performed composure that functioned as his primary mode of being in the world. It was the stillness of someone who has stopped performing entirely because the presence in the room has made performance impossible, has reached through every layer of it and rendered it beside the point. Elena crossed the room toward him. She moved with the particular unhurried certainty of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has decided not to rush it, to give each step its full weight. And Damon watched her come with an expression that was more unguarded than Bonnie had ever seen on his face in all the time she had known him. More unguarded perhaps than it had been in a very long time. The armor of him set aside not through force or defeat, but through the simple and complete impossibility of maintaining it in the face of Elena Gilbert walking toward him in a room where she was supposed to be dead. She stopped in front of him. She looked up at him because he was taller, and the looking was the same kind of looking that had passed between her and Stefan. The full and complete attention of someone who sees you specifically and without reduction, and has decided that the seeing is the thing that matters most right now, before anything is said or done, before any of the practical urgencies of the situation are addressed. "Damon," she said. He said nothing. He was very still, and his jaw was set in the way it's set when he was holding something in place that wanted to move, and his black eyes were on her face with an intensity that was not his usual assessing intensity, but something raw and less managed than that. "I know," Elena said softly, as though he had spoken, as though whatever he was holding in place had reached her anyway, through whatever channel was available to someone who existed where she existed now, with a broader perception that came with it. "I know, Damon." What happened in his face in the moment after she said that was brief, and would not have been visible to anyone who was not watching him with the attention Bonnie had developed for his particular expressions. A fractional loosening of every feature, simultaneous and immediate, as though a sustained tension had been briefly released before it was re-established, as though the thing he had been holding in place had moved despite his holding, and returned before it could be seen clearly. He looked away from her for exactly 2 seconds, at the wall beside her head, and then back, and the armor was in place again, but it was wearing it differently, carrying it with the particular quality of someone who has put on a familiar coat and discovered it no longer fits quite the way it did. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was entirely steady, which was the most honest thing about it. "I know," Elena said, "but I am, and there are things I need to tell you, things I need to tell all of you, and I don't have as much time as I would like for any of it." She turned back to the room, and the quality of her presence shifted, the tenderness of the reunion still present, but joined now by something more urgent, the focus of someone who has carried important information across an enormous distance and is now at the moment of delivery. She moved to the center of the room and looked at each of them in turn, and what she carried in her expression was not fear, but the particular seriousness of someone who has seen something clearly and needs others to see it clearly too. "Klaus," she said, "I need to tell you what I know about him, about what he is and what he wants and where he is vulnerable." She looked at Bonnie specifically. "And I need to tell you what you are capable of, Bonnie, because you are capable of more than you currently understand. And the gap between what you understand and what you can actually do is the gap that determines whether any of this works." She began to speak about Klaus with the particular clarity of someone who had been watching him from a vantage point that the living did not have access to, who had seen the full architecture of what he was rather than the express surface of it. She described his origin with a precision that went beyond what Damon had been able to provide from the vampire world's historical accounts, because what Elena could see from where she was included, not just the historical record, but the actual substance of the thing itself, the foundational material that Damon had inferred and Bonnie had touched peripherally, and which Elena could now describe directly. He'd been made, she said, in an act that should not have been possible, a transgression against the boundary between the living world and what lay beyond it, that had been forced rather than negotiated, taken rather than given. The power he carried was not power in the conventional sense because it was not his. It had been taken from the same foundational source that Bonnie's ability drew from the boundary itself, from the force that maintained the distinction between the living and the dead. His origin was a wound in that boundary, and the wound had never healed, and it was that wound, that specific and original point of transgression, that remained accessible to the right kind of touch across all the centuries of power he had built above it. The boundary recognizes what it is missing, Elena said. It has always recognized it. When Bonnie touched the edge of it at his location, what she felt responding to her was the boundary itself, calling back toward its own nature through the opening of his wound. She didn't touch Klaus. She touched what he took, and what he took remembers what it is and where it belongs. "How do I use that?" Bonnie asked. The question was practical and direct, and she asked it without any of the fear that lived alongside it, because the fear was real and the practicality was more important right now. "You reach through him," Elena said. lose your ability to move between the living world and what lies beyond it, and you reach through the wound of his origin to what was taken, and you give it a way back. You do not fight his power. You return the thing that power was built from. You remind the boundary of itself through the opening he represents. Will it destroy him? Stefan asked. It will unmake what was made incorrectly, Elena said carefully. What happens to Klaus in that unmaking is not something I can describe with precision, because it involves a process I can see the shape of, but not the specific details of. What I can tell you is that it will not leave him as he is. The power he has carried for centuries is built on something that does not belong to him. When that something is returned to where it belongs, the structure above it does not remain standing. Damon said from the wall. How does she reach through him without him preventing it? He will try to prevent it, Elena said. That is the most honest answer. When he understands what is happening, when he feels the reaching begin, he will bring everything he has against it, which means the reaching cannot be something he can interrupt. It has to be initiated at the level of the wound itself, below the level of his conscious power, before he understands what is being done. She looked at Bonnie again, which means the approach has to be through the connection you have already established, the peripheral contact you made at the boundary. You go back to that contact and you hold it and you deepen it, slowly and carefully, below the threshold of what his active power is monitoring, until you are deep enough that interrupting you would require him to access the wound himself. And accessing it himself is the one thing he cannot do without making it worse. He has to not see it coming, Matt said. He has to not see it coming until it is already happening, Elena confirmed, which requires bringing him into a confrontation that holds his full attention while Bonnie works below it. He needs something to look at, something that constitutes a genuine challenge to him, something that engages the parts of him that are alert and reactive and managing the situation, so that the part of him that is the wound is left unattended. That would be us, Damon said. It was not a question. That would be you, Elena said. Stefan and Damon drawing his full engagement, his power meeting yours openly, a confrontation he finds genuinely challenging, which means it has to be real, has to be actually dangerous, has to be something he cannot dismiss with a fraction of his attention. Stefan looked at Damon across the room. Something passed between them that was wordless and complete, the compressed communication of a shared history that was very long and very complicated, and it arrived, despite everything, at this point of the convergence. When? Stefan asked, turning back to Eleanor. Soon, she said. He's approaching the end of the phase he has been in. The amusement is shifting. I can feel it from here, the way you can feel weather changing before it changes visibly. He is moving towards something more direct, and once he moves toward it, the terms of everything change. The approach I have described requires conditions that exist now, that will not exist in the same way once he escalates. You have days, not many. The room held this, all of them holding it simultaneously, the weight of the timeline added to everything else they were carrying. Elena stood in the center of them and looked at each face in turn, and Bonnie felt the quality of her attention moving from person to person with the specific and named love of someone who knows they are running out of time and is making sure that each person receives the full measure of what they are owed before the time runs out. She spent longer with Stefan, who received her attention with his eyes open, and his expression no longer managed at all, simply present in what was happening with the courage of someone who has decided that full presence is what the moment requires, regardless of what it costs. "I need to tell you something," Elena said to him quietly, in a register that was meant for him specifically, even though the room could hear it, even though none of them looked away. "I need you to know that where I am is not where I was afraid it would be. I was afraid when it was happening, afraid of what lay on the other side. But what is on the other side is not what fear imagines. It is not absence. It is not loss. It is somewhere, and from somewhere I love you. And that love is not smaller for the distance. If anything, it is larger, because from here I can see all of it, everything we were to each other, and it is more than I understood when I was inside it." Stefan did not speak. He looked at her, and his expression held everything, absolutely everything, and he let her see it, all of it, without managing any of it. "You have to let me go," she said, "not because what we had was not real or not worth holding, but because holding me is holding you in place. And you have so much ahead of you, Stefan. You have centuries ahead of you, and I can see them from here, and they are not empty. I cannot tell you what is in them, but I can tell you they are not empty." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted, something enormous and slow and difficult, the way geological things shift, not quickly and not without cost, but completely, all the way through. "All right," he said. The words were very quiet and very certain. "All right." Eleanor looked at Damon one more time, a last look that was brief and complete and said everything that had not been said and would not be said, everything that existed in the particular and complicated space that had always existed between them, and that she was not going to resolve into something simpler than it actually was, because it deserved its full complexity, and she had always known that and was choosing, even now, to honor it. Damon held her gaze. He did not look away this time. He received what she was giving with the stillness of someone who has stopped fighting what is happening and is choosing instead to simply be in it, to let it be real, to not spend the remaining seconds of it protecting himself from the fullness of what it is. Then she began to fade, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical machinery of disappearance, but with the gentle and gradual recession of something returning to where it belongs, the luminous quality of her presence softening by degrees until it was a warmth in the room rather than a presence in it, and then a memory of warmth, and then the room was as it had been before, with the lamp on the floor and the five of them around the table and the November dark outside the windows. The silence afterward was very long and very full. No one spoke for several minutes, because several minutes was the appropriate duration for what they were all holding, and rushing past it would have been wrong in a way that everyone understood without discussing. It was Matt who spoke first, which surprised Bonnie until she thought about it, and then it did not surprise her at all. Matt had always been the one who understood when the necessary thing was to move forward, not because the feeling was over, but because moving forward was what the feeling was asking for. "All right," he said, using the same words Stefan had used, with the same quality of completeness in them. "We know what we need to do. Let's figure out how to do it." And they began. The confrontation with Klaus happened at the boundary, which was fitting, because the boundary was where everything in this story had ultimately lived, the line between the living and the dead, between the human world and the supernatural one, between what could be held onto and what had to be let go. Stefan and Damon met him there in the open, without concealment or strategy in the visible sense. Two brothers standing together in the cold dark at the edge of the constructed space Klaus had made his own, offering him exactly what Eleanor had said he needed to be offered. A genuine challenge, something worth his full and ancient attention. Klaus was everything they had been told he was. The power of him was physical, pressing against the night air like a weather system, like something that altered the atmosphere simply by being present in it. He looked at Stefan and Damon with a particular interest of something that has been waiting for an opposition worthy of it, and the interest itself was dangerous, because Klaus's full interest had historically preceded catastrophe. He brought his power against them without restraint, without the modulation he wore in the town, and what Stefan and Damon held against it cost them both more than they showed, more than they would ever fully describe to the others afterward. They held, that was what mattered. They held his attention completely, engaged the full active force of what he was, and kept it engaged, kept it directed at them, and away from the periphery of the space, where something small and red-haired and completely focused was doing the most important work of her life. Bonnie reached through the wound of his origin with everything she had developed over the weeks of practice and the nights of reaching and the long accumulated discipline of extending herself further than she had believed she could extend. She went below the level of his active power, below the constructed darkness of the space he had built, below the centuries of accumulated strength and the vanity and the ancient intelligence, all the way down to the foundational thing, the original material that had been taken from the boundary and built upon and held for longer than she could fully comprehend. She touched it, and this time she did not withdraw. She held the contact and she deepened it, slowly and with extraordinary care, the way you lower yourself into very cold water, one careful inch at a time, staying present with each stage of it before moving to the next. And as she deepened the contact, she felt what Elena had described beginning to happen. The boundary recognizing itself through the opening of Klaus's wound. The taken thing responding to the reaching of someone who carried the boundary's nature in her own lineage and her own blood. And the long line of women behind her who had always lived at the edge of the living world and the world beyond it. She did not fight him. She did not try to overpower anything. She simply opened the way back for what had been taken, made herself a channel for the returning of it, and held that channel open with everything she had while Stefan and Damon held Klaus's rage and his power from the other direction. What happened when the returning completed itself was not an explosion or a battle won in the conventional sense. It was more like a structure losing its foundation. The enormous darkness of what Klaus had built across his centuries of existence did not fall dramatically. It simply became unsupported. And unsupported things do not last, regardless of how long or how impressively they have stood. The power went out of him the way light goes out of a room when a source is removed, completely and without negotiation. And what remained where Klaus had been was not something that required further engagement. It was over. Fell's church breathed in the days that followed, the way a person breathes after a sustained period of holding their breath, deeply and with the particular relief of the body resuming something it is designed to do. The quality of the air changed. The wrongness that Bonnie had been carrying in her perception since the earliest days of autumn, that low and constant pressure that had pressed at the edges of her awareness like a sound felt in the bones, lifted so gradually and so completely that she only fully registered its absence when she realized she had walked to school one morning without bracing against it. It was simply gone. The town was simply a town again, imperfect and ordinary and completely itself, and the ordinariness of it was the most beautiful thing she had experienced in a very long time. The people who had been used as instruments, Vicky and the teacher, and the others who had carried Klaus's messages in voices that were not their own, recovered in the quiet way that people recover from things they cannot fully account for. The borrowed experiences fading like dreams, the ordinary texture of their lives reasserting itself with the reliable persistence of the ordinary. They would carry something of it, the way all people carry the residue of difficult things, but they would not be defined by it. Fell's Church was resilient. It had proven that more than once. Stefan left, and this time the leaving was different from the first time. The first leaving had been grief driving him out, the inability to remain in the place where Elena had died. This leaving was quieter than that, chosen rather than compelled. A man who'd been given something extraordinary by the woman he loved, and was now moving into the space she had told him was not empty. He said goodbye properly this time, to each of them, and the goodbyes were full of everything that had happened between them, and were not sad in any simple sense, because nothing that contains that much truth can be only sad. Damon left without saying goodbye, which was entirely consistent with every other thing he had ever done, and which fooled none of them for a moment into thinking the leaving was without feeling. He paused at the door, his back to the room, for exactly long enough to communicate that the pause was deliberate, that something in him was acknowledging what had happened here, and what it had cost, and what it had given, even if that acknowledgement would never be spoken in any language anyone could quote back to him. Then he was gone, and the particular quality of his absence was different from what it had been before, carrying something in it that had not been there when he first arrived in Fell's Church, something small and unannounced and permanent. Bonnie and Meredith and Matt remained. They were changed, all three of them, in ways that would take years to fully understand, altered by everything they had witnessed and survived and chosen in the weeks since the night of the first strange pressure. They had stood against something ancient and enormous with the tools available to them, which were love and friendship, and the stubborn refusal to leave each other to face difficult things alone. And those tools had been sufficient, not because they were the most powerful tools available in the world, but because they had been wielded by people who meant them completely. The three of them sat together in Meredith's kitchen in the first quiet evening after everything had resolved, and the kitchen was warm and ordinary and full of the small sounds of a house at rest, and none of them felt the need to fill the quiet with words. There was nothing left to plan, no information to organize, no pattern to identify or threat to address. There was only this: three people who loved each other sitting in the warmth, alive. If there is a Vampire Diaries story you would love to fall asleep to next, tell me in the comments. I would love to create it for you. And now, let the quiet carry you the rest of the way. You are safe. You are warm. And some loves do not end. They simply find a new way to stay.